Growing up, I always knew I wasn't the center of my parents' world. I didn't resent them for it at first. I told myself they were just tired, busy, and doing their best. But looking back now, I wonder how long I stayed blind to the truth. It all started when my dad lost his job. I must have been around 8. I remember overhearing hushed conversations late at night about money. We had to move out of our house and into a cramped apartment. My parents were stressed, constantly filling out job applications. Eventually, Mom got a job with an old contact from her past work. It didn't pay much, but it was better than nothing. We scraped by. Dad found work a few months later, and things got a little better, at least on the surface. But the cracks in our family started showing. My parents were distant, too preoccupied with survival to notice me. Conversations became curt exchanges of good morning and bye. I stopped trying to tell them about my day because they weren't really listening. Then, one day, Mom told me she was pregnant. I was excited. I thought having a sibling would mean I wouldn't be so lonely anymore. But my excitement quickly faded when I realized what my parents were truly capable of. When Mom's belly started to show, I thought things would change. Maybe they'd smile more, talk to me, include me. I had all these fantasies about what life would be like with a little sibling. I pictured us playing together, laughing, and finally feeling like a real family. But instead of bringing us closer, it pushed me further into the shadows. All their focus shifted to Mom and the baby. Dad started coming home even later, and when he did, he was always carrying something for Mom or the baby. It wasn't just about money anymore. It felt like they were building a new life without me in it. I still tried to help, cleaning up around the house, doing little things to make their lives easier. But no one noticed. I used to wait by the window, hoping they'd look at me and see me. I craved a simple hug or even a tired smile. But it never happened. The first time I tried to hug Mom after she came home, she shrugged me off, irritated. She told me she was exhausted and didn't have time for nonsense. I stood there, frozen, watching her walk away like I was a stranger begging for scraps of attention. Dad wasn't much better. He'd come in, drop off whatever he'd brought for Mom, and go straight to their room. One night, I tried to tell him about my day at school. He looked up for a second, said, "That's nice," and went back to whatever he was doing. I stopped trying after that. The loneliness hit harder when Mom was in her 3rd trimester. They barely acknowledged my existence. I was old enough to understand that pregnancy was tough, but it felt like they only had room for one child now, and it wasn't me. When my sister was born, I was excited all over again. I thought maybe this was my chance. Maybe they'd let me be a part of it. I asked Dad if I could see her, and he finally let me into their room. Mom was breastfeeding at the time, and as soon as I stepped inside, she snapped at me to get out. "She needs peace and quiet," she said sharply, without even looking at me. Dad didn't say a word. He just closed the door in my face. I stood there in the hallway, staring at that closed door, feeling like a ghost in my own house. Things only got worse after my sister was born. It wasn't like in the movies, where the older sibling gets to hold the baby and feel like part of the family. Nope. Mom barely let me near her. Every time I tried, it ended with her telling me to leave the baby alone. I'll admit, at first, I thought maybe I just wasn't good at it. Maybe I didn't know how to hold a baby properly, or maybe I was too loud. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Mom wasn't protecting my sister from me. She just didn't want me around. Dad tried a couple of times to include me. Small things like letting me hand him a diaper or rock the baby's crib for a minute. But it never lasted. Mom would walk in, sigh loudly, and take over like I was doing something wrong. Eventually, I stopped trying. What was the point? We moved back into our old house when my sister was a few months old. I thought that might change things. I figured maybe, just maybe, we could go back to how things were before. But that hope didn't last long. The house had 2 bedrooms, and you'd think I'd get one of them, right? Wrong. Mom and Dad gave the 2nd bedroom to my sister. "And where am I supposed to sleep?" I asked, feeling stupid for even having to ask. Dad rubbed the back of his neck like he was uncomfortable, but Mom didn't hesitate. The attic. The attic. I had to clean it out myself. It was dusty, dark, and freezing cold at night. There wasn't even any wiring for a light. I had to bring a flashlight with me, and when the batteries died, I'd just sit in the dark, staring at the shadows. At first, I'd sneak back downstairs after they went to bed and sleep on the couch, but they caught me a few times, and after that, they didn't even bother telling me to go back up. As long as I was out of their way, they didn't care where I slept. I remember sitting on that couch one night, staring at the ceiling, and wondering how we'd gotten here. How did I go from being their kid to whatever this was? When I got older, I managed to get a part-time job. They didn't know about it, and honestly, I didn't want them to. My first paycheck felt like a lifeline. I had this fleeting thought that maybe I could buy something for them. Maybe that would make them like me again. But I wasn't that naive anymore. Instead, I saved every penny. University was the only way out, and I knew I'd have to figure it out on my own. I brought it up once at dinner, mentioning scholarships and how I was applying everywhere. Mom barely looked up from her plate. "You don't need to worry about that," she said. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "We don't have the money for it," Dad said. "Besides, you're fine where you are. Why do you need to go to university?" That was the moment it really hit me. They weren't just neglecting me. They had no plans for me at all. I don't know why their reaction to me wanting to go to university surprised me. It shouldn't have. Deep down, I already knew they didn't care. But hearing them say it out loud still hurt. So I stopped bringing it up. I stopped talking to them about my future altogether. I poured everything I had into applying for scholarships. I knew I couldn't rely on them for a penny, so my only way out was to get a full ride. I'd sneak over to my neighbor's house to use his laptop since we didn't have one at home. He was a kind man, recently moved into the neighborhood, with a daughter about my age. They didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated. I applied to every scholarship I could find. Some nights I'd sit there with his daughter, both of us typing away in silence, sharing snacks, and a mutual understanding that we were both just trying to make something of ourselves. When I finally got accepted to a university, I was thrilled. I'd gotten partial scholarships, which covered tuition, but I still needed to figure out living expenses. The school was 2 states away, and I knew I'd need a job to survive. I reached out to a cafe near campus, asking if they had any positions available. The owner, an older lady named Auntie Marie, was warm and welcoming right from the start. She offered me a job on the spot and even told me I could crash in the small room above the cafe until I found my own place. It felt like fate. The day I packed up and left, my parents didn't even notice. I didn't make a big announcement. I simply packed my few belongings into a beat-up duffel bag, left a note on the kitchen table, and walked out. I remember standing outside the house, staring at the front door for a moment. Part of me hoped someone would come running out, Mom, Dad, even my sister, to stop me, to say they'd miss me, but the door stayed shut. No calls, no texts, nothing. When I got to the cafe, Auntie Marie was waiting for me with a warm smile and a plate of cookies. It was the first time in years someone looked genuinely happy to see me. "You must be tired from the trip," she said, handing me the keys to the room upstairs. "Go on up and rest. We'll sort everything out tomorrow." I could have cried right then and there, but I held it together, thanked her, and made my way upstairs. The room was small, but it was mine. For the first time, I had a space that felt like home. I started working at the cafe the next day. Auntie Marie didn't just treat me like an employee, she treated me like family. She'd fuss over me, make sure I was eating enough, and even scold me if I worked too hard. It was strange at first. I wasn't used to someone caring about me that way. Over time, I picked up extra shifts and found other odd jobs to cover my expenses. I'd wake up early for classes, work through the afternoons, and study late into the night. It was exhausting, but it felt good. It felt right. For the first time, I was building a life that was truly mine. University flew by in a blur of sleepless nights, work shifts, and quiet moments of pride when I realized I was doing it. I was making it on my own. Auntie Marie became my rock. She wasn't just my boss, she was my family. When I landed a pre-placement job at a company in the city, Auntie Marie was the first person I told. I'll never forget the way her face lit up when I showed her the offer letter. She hugged me tight, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." I cried that day, not because of the job, but because someone was proud of me. She helped me move closer to my new job, and even after I settled in, I'd go back to visit her at least once a month. We stayed in touch, regular calls, texts, and postcards. She always reminded me to take care of myself and to never let the past weigh me down. At work, I started making friends, which was new for me. I'd always been shy, preferring to keep to myself, but my colleagues didn't let me fade into the background. They dragged me out for coffee breaks, lunch outings, and even after-work drinks. About a year in, the company surprised us with free tickets for a weekend getaway. We could each bring someone along. For me, the choice was obvious. I invited Auntie Marie. At first, she refused. "Oh no, you should take someone your age," she said, waving her hand dismissively. But I insisted. "You're my family," I told her. When we arrived at the resort, everyone was curious about who I'd brought. Auntie Marie charmed them all within minutes. She was an extrovert in every sense, the kind of person who made friends wherever she went. The trip was going well until something unexpected happened. A man approached me. I was awkward at first. Dating had never been on my radar. Between surviving my childhood, getting through school, and focusing on work, I never thought about romance. But there he was, kind and patient, with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. Auntie Marie practically squealed when she saw him talking to me. "Go with him," she whispered, nudging me. I ended up spending most of that trip with him. His name was Jake, and he lived about half an hour from where I worked. When we got back, he called me and asked me out. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready for something like that. But Auntie Marie nudged me again. "Take a chance," she said with a knowing smile. Jake and I dated for a couple of months before making it official. He was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was comfortable with. When I finally opened up about my family, he listened without judgment. "I hate them for what they did to you," he said quietly, after I told him everything. I shook my head. "Don't waste your energy hating them. They don't deserve it." 3 years later, we were married. Auntie Marie sat in the front row, beaming like a proud mother. I invited my parents and my sister, even though I knew they wouldn't come. And they didn't. Jake wasn't surprised. In fact, he didn't even want to invite them in the first place. "They don't deserve to be part of your happiness," he told me. But I guess part of me still hoped they'd show up. A year later, I found out I was pregnant. Jake was over the moon. His parents welcomed me with open arms, treating me like the daughter they never had. Auntie Marie visited regularly, and we were surrounded by love in a way I'd never experienced before. Life was good, peaceful, until the letter arrived. I was 5 months pregnant when Auntie Marie called me about the letter. "It's from your parents," she said cautiously. "Do you want me to bring it to you?" Hearing that made my heart skip a beat. I hadn't heard from them in years, not a single call or text, not even a congrats for my wedding. But now, out of the blue, they were reaching out. For a split second, I felt hopeful. Maybe they'd heard about the baby. Maybe they wanted to make things right. Jake wasn't as optimistic. He sat beside me, frowning as I told him about the letter. "I don't like it," he said. "They've ignored you all these years, and now, suddenly they want to talk? It's sus." I nodded, but part of me still clung to that little flicker of hope. "Can you read it first? Just in case it's bad?" Auntie Marie showed up a couple of days later with the letter in hand. Jake took it from her, sat at the table, and carefully opened it. I watched his face as he read. The disgust in his expression told me everything I needed to know. He folded the letter, set it on the table, and pulled me into a hug. "You don't need to read it," he said softly. "It's awful." I wasn't letting it go that easily. "I need to hear it," I whispered. "Please." Auntie Marie picked up the letter and started reading it aloud. Her voice trembled with disbelief as she went through each line. My parents hadn't reached out to reconnect or apologize. They weren't interested in my life or the baby. No, they were in trouble, and they wanted me to bail them out. It turned out they'd lost the house, the same house they'd put in my sister's name to pay for her lavish wedding, the same house she had mortgaged without a second thought. Her husband had left her, the bank took the house, and now they were broke. And somehow, they thought I owed them. The letter was full of guilt-tripping nonsense about how they took care of me for so many years, and how I should repay the favor. They even listed expenses: food, clothes, a roof over my head, as if I was some tenant who'd never paid rent. I sat there staring at the table, my mind blank. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, rubbing my back gently. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I really was. That night, I cried myself to sleep. Not because I was sad, I was angry. Angry that they still thought they had some hold over me. Angry that they dared to reach out now, after everything. Jake and I talked it through the next morning. I told him I wasn't going to let them ruin the life we'd built. They weren't part of it then, and they sure as hell weren't going to be part of it now. We got a lawyer involved. They sent a formal letter back to my parents, a warning to never contact me again. And just to make things clear, we included a separate letter detailing the neglect I'd endured growing up. I made sure they knew I didn't owe them a damn thing. Not for the food I barely ate, not for the clothes I wore until they were threadbare, and definitely not for the roof over my head when they stuck me in the attic like some unwanted guest. "You reached out to the wrong child," I wrote. "The child you should be asking is the one you put the house in her name, the one who mortgaged it and left you homeless." A couple of months later, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Jake was right there with me, holding my hand through every contraction, tears in his eyes when he saw our son for the first time. Auntie Marie visited the next day, holding our baby like he was her own grandchild. Life was good again, peaceful. I heard through the grapevine that my sister ended up giving the house to the bank. I don't know where my parents are now, and honestly, I don't care. They dug their hole. They can figure out how to climb out of it. As for me, I'm happy. I have a husband who loves me, a son who will grow up surrounded by love, and a family I chose for myself. They'll never take that away from me. That's it. That's the end of my story. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you when it matters. I found my family, and I'm never looking back. Story 2. While we were having financial difficulties, my wife was surreptitiously looking for a second family on the opposite side of town. So I went to court and filed for divorce. I am now 38. Like many couples, my wife and I leased a modest home, had financial difficulties, and occasionally had to deal with credit card debt. We didn't have children, which occasionally made me regret not having children sooner, but we continued putting off having that talk. I always believed her when she told that we couldn't afford children at the moment. Ultimately, funds were limited. Depending on who needs an additional pair of hands, I go between construction sites in my line of work. She was a self-employed consultant. What exactly? With every contract, she provided consultation on changes. However, I reasoned that everything would be well as long as she was helping with food and rent. She would remain out late, sometimes saying she had to go to industry mixers or meet with customers. Her hustle was something I used to admire. I regret not being more skeptical in the past. She promised to be home one evening, but she was hours late, bringing takeaway as a sacrifice for peace. I recall her looking very worn out, with red hair and unkempt hair. "Sorry," she mumbled. "After a hard day, I immediately went to the bedroom to collapse. She only packed enough food for herself, which I found odd, but I assumed it was just carelessness. As she slept that night, I started to worry about whether we would be able to pay the rent in 2 weeks. My paycheck wasn't covering all of the past due bills we had. Every time I inquired when she would deposit her half, she said she would do it shortly. Her responses were evasive. I was given an early day off from the building site a week later. I made the decision to review our budget and take on some housework. All of her receipts were stored in a shoebox. She termed it her budgeting approach. I searched through them in the hopes that I may be able to classify costs and determine our current situation. At that point, I discovered a few receipts that were completely out of balance. An electric bill that most clearly wasn't for our apartment, along with many grocery invoices from a supermarket in a totally other neighborhood across town. The addresses were in black and white, which initially made me think there could have been a mix-up. Utility payments were being made at a location I had never heard of. My heart was racing. She can be filling in for a relative. Perhaps she was supporting a friend or cousin who was going through a difficult time. However, they didn't explain why the shopping purchases included big packs of nappies, infant formula, and fresh food. We didn't need nappies for ourselves, and we didn't have children. My curiosity overcame me. I quickly looked up the address on the power bill online. About 15 miles distant, it was next to a park in a residential area. I had been there once. The building was a little front garden of an older home. My mind was racing with so many questions. I chose to remain calm and wait for additional proof rather than addressing her straight away. I needed something specific if I was making assumptions. I used her laptop to stealthily examine our bank statements over the course of the following several days. Sometimes I knew she would go immediately. I saw many monthly payments to the same utility providers linked to the water mystery location. Gas. Online. To my dismay, a constant flow of payments was made, all from her own checking account, but sometimes with combined monies. Some nights, in an effort to save money, we were eating instant noodles at home, as if she were transferring funds to a whole different home. I barely slept throughout the day for the next week. I continued to labor, moving goods or running large machines. I was unable to communicate my distraction to my coworkers. I didn't want rumors to start spreading after work, and this was just too crazy. On the first trip, I occasionally drove past that other address rather than going directly home. When I parked a few homes away, I noticed toys all over the yard and a minivan in the driveway. It appeared to be a scene from a normal family's suburban existence. Might it be my wife's? I remained in my car longer one night, watching. An hour or so later, she showed up dressed in what I knew were clothing from our wardrobe. It was her, without a doubt. She was talking to a man on the porch when she left the house through the front door. Then she was approached by two tiny toddlers. She followed them back inside after bending down to give them both a hug. My head whirled. Was she their mom? Did you take on the role of carer for a friend, or were these children hers? Although I entertained the possibility, I secretly feared the worst. At the time, she was leading two separate lives. I had an option: get further evidence or confront her directly. I made the decision to get further evidence. I reasoned that I could need proof to defend myself if this became a court case or a divorce. The emotional tornado that ensued, however, caught me off guard. She pretended that nothing had happened when she was back at our house. She complained about our landlord's new regulations, told me she was so tired from work, and fumbled in the pantry for food. I finally went up to her a few of nights later. "How did your day go?" I inquired. She didn't respond to me as she usually does. Dull. Nothing noteworthy. Only meetings. I pushed harder. In the nights. "Where do you go, exactly?" She put down the plate she was cleaning and froze. "What are you saying?" With a sharp edge in her voice, she questioned. "I try not to show my emotions. We've incurred all these additional costs, and I've seen that you frequently arrive home late." She became defensive at that point, accusing me of spying and claiming I had no right to inquire about her time management. She yelled, "You're not my keeper." I slept out on the couch that night, my thoughts racing. I made the decision to phone a lawyer in the morning. A good family law lawyer was recommended by a coworker of mine who had gone through a difficult divorce. The lawyer didn't seem shocked when I told him about my suspicions over the phone. "It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen," she added. "Documentation will be required. Anything that demonstrates a habit of providing financial assistance to another family, particularly when it affects marital assets. It would be a serious betrayal that may affect a divorce case if she really has another family." Bank statements, pictures of her at that residence, utility and grocery receipts, and even credit card bills from strange kids' clothes stores were all gathered over the course of the following several days. She would periodically throw me curveballs, so I avoided getting into direct arguments with her and allowed her maintain the illusion. "Next weekend, my customer needs me to stay overnight on a project, or I'm traveling on a business trip." Every time I nodded, I was quietly storing more proof. The tension finally broke. We were both in the kitchen one Sunday morning. Her phone, which she had left on the counter, began to ring just as I was about to face her more directly. A photo of two children embracing her from behind was displayed on the caller ID. I snatched it up without thinking and replied. A man's voice said, "Hey, the kids want pancakes and we're out of milk." I remained mute in shock as he said, "Hello?" again. "Have you heard me?" She grabbed the phone and hung up. I gazed at her. "Who was that?" I inquired. "One more customer." Her face became white. Then she almost spit out. "Please hand me my phone. You have no business about it." I didn't move. I have complete control over it. If you're using our joint funds to support a different family, another spouse, or a different group of children, how could you harm me like this?" She hesitated for a moment, eyes darting about as though seeking a credible falsehood. Then she responded with a level of entitlement that surprised me. "I am quite entitled to spend money anyway I see appropriate. Furthermore, perhaps we wouldn't be in this predicament if you made more money." I was astounded by that excuse. While she was covertly providing for a whole second family, she was accusing me of not earning enough money. "We'll leave this to the attorneys," I added, looking her in the eye. It was then that she knew it was finished. That Monday, I had a meeting with my lawyer. I had a folder full of prints and pictures by that point. As she flipped through them, the lawyer's eyes grew wide. She called this substantial evidence. "We can apply for divorce right away on the basis of possible bigamy and financial adultery. If we learn that another marriage is at play," a chilly chill went through me. Was the other man really my wife's husband? Or was it only a case of cohabitation? It didn't really matter either way. I had had enough of her lies. According to my lawyer, I could expect a bitter battle, particularly if my wife attempted to collect spousal support. But her case would probably be weak because of the obvious misappropriation of marital finances. She said that things would get more difficult if there were any children that were biologically related to both of us. Fortunately, we didn't have any. Not with each other. That weekend, I served divorce papers. After a few days of pouting, she returned to our home, probably to get her belongings. She laughed mockingly as I gave her the paperwork bundle. "Do you believe I'm in a tight spot? Nothing can be proven by you. We're wed. I may aid anybody I choose because what's mine is mine." With a tone full of entitlement, she went on. "In any case, I'll just tell the judge that you took advantage of me financially. I needed to figure out how to live." I inhaled deeply. "Will the court view it that way, in your opinion? When they discover that you have been secretly using our money to sustain a completely different home, I wish you luck in your endeavor." She makes your jaw tight. "It's not your place to snoop on me. Since you began lying and using shared funds to support your double life, you have given up any claim to privacy." I returned fire. She backed away and slammed the door of the bedroom. I went outside because I didn't want to hear people shouting or hurling objects. She hurried out of the home with a bag an hour or so later, making care to knock a lamp off a table en route. I released her. She was accusing me of abandoning her, according to mutual acquaintances I spoke with in the days that followed, making up a story about how I didn't support her financially or emotionally, therefore she had to go for assistance elsewhere. Some in my social circle questioned if I had truly abandoned her. I subtly revealed just enough information to imply that she had secrets of her own, without delving into specifics. Several friends said that they had observed strange differences in her work, but had never been able to connect the dots. Some people immediately believed me. Others were unsure about their thoughts. When he heard the account, my father told me to keep my head up. "You didn't fail, son," he continued. She made up her mind. In addition to being sad, my mother was incensed that her daughter-in-law had deceived me. Such like this. Despite their offer of lodging, I decided to stay at the house for the time being. I wasn't going to give up my house so simply, and my name was on the lease. My lawyer is a speedy lawyer. She submitted motions to freeze our joint accounts until the court determined the best way to divide up our assets. During a preliminary hearing, my wife's attorney said that there was a miscommunication and that the money was being used to support a family in need. However, we had records from our phones, receipts, and even pictures that provided a different picture. The judge didn't find it funny. She agreed to my request to safeguard our remaining assets and set up a more involved court date for the divorce process. My soon-to-be ex-wife, meanwhile, was incensed. She threatened to expose me to everyone who would listen to her flurry of texts accusing me of sabotage. She repeatedly knocked on the front door and demanded to be let in so she could get some vital things. She consistently resisted my requests for her to coordinate through my lawyer in case she needed anything, claiming she wouldn't go through the legal formalities. I refused to back down. She appeared with the other man one evening. He was someone I knew from my stakeouts. Tall, unkempt, with a baseball cap on. "We're here for stuff," he said, trying to get past me. "Don't complicate this." I signaled with my phone that if they did anything, I would contact the police. The man scoffed. "Man, you can't stay near." However, I gently reiterated that they could work with my attorney to have her belongings picked up at a certain time, under supervision if needed. They swore, and then backed off. The divorce process took several months to complete. More information surfaced throughout that period. It turned out that for about 2 years, my wife had been living a part-time existence with that man. She behaved as a surrogate mother, although those children were his from a past relationship, bringing them on weekend excursions and paying their expenses. She explained to him that I was only a roommate, and that the money in our joint bank account was an inheritance she had inherited. Even her own attorney was astounded by the extent of her deception and ultimately suggested that she settle. My proof outweighed her justifications when the formal trial phase eventually arrived. We provided unmistakable evidence that she was transferring shared funds to that other residence. According to my lawyer, I had been duped during the marriage and she was effectively using me as a financial safety net, while spending her money elsewhere. On the majority of issues, the court agreed with me. She was not granted spousal maintenance, and I was given the lion's share of our remaining marital property. She was held accountable for some of the debts she accrued while leading a covert double life. Better still, the judge placed a hold on her freelancing accounts until she paid back specific sums. Witnessing her attitude of entitlement disintegrate beneath the weight of the law was a rewarding kind of justice. She attempted to corner me outside the courthouse following the judgment. She yelled, her face contorted with rage. "I hope all is well with you. My life was wrecked by you." I gazed at her in awe at her distorted viewpoint. "That you did yourself," I said coolly. "You took from me and lied. I was used by you, and now you have to deal with the fallout." She tried one final shady maneuver. My landlord got in touch with me a few weeks later to inform me that I had received a letter accusing me of domestic abuse. I promptly forwarded the letter to my lawyer, who promptly responded with court documents demonstrating the divorce proceedings in a protective order I'd filed against her attempts to forcibly enter the property. She claimed I was making our home unsafe, presumably in an attempt to have me evicted. The landlord dismissed it. She never again attempted that angle. It was a bittersweet day when I eventually moved out. I made the decision to move out of that house, get a new flat, and start again. I was relieved and saddened by the life I believed I had as I packed up my belongings. However, there was no turning back now. After filing the paperwork and enduring the court cases, I was finally at liberty. Her second family arrangement ultimately didn't turn out a lot better. According to a mutual acquaintance, the man evicted her after discovering the bills and realizing she was unable to support their way of life. She was living on a friend's sofa and whining about how unfair things had been when I last heard from her. Now that I think about it, I see that the deception was the worst betrayal, not simply the money. The idea that while we were struggling to keep up a front elsewhere, she might deplete our common resources. However, I emerged from the experience with a more solid understanding of my identity and the things I would not put up with in a romantic partnership. I discovered that once trust is lost, it cannot be restored with justifications, and that if someone believes they can take advantage of you, they will continue to do so until you defend yourself.